The German shepherd lay motionless in the mud, his ribs visible beneath his tattered fur. Rain poured down, mixing with the blood seeping from his wounds. But as headlights approached in the distance, fate was about to take an unimaginable turn. The storm raged over the quiet outskirts of the city, wind howling through skeletal trees, rain slamming against the asphalt like furious hands pounding on a locked door. The roads were empty. No one wanted to be out in this weather. But amidst the downpour, a figure lay still, motionless in the mud. A German shepherd, barely more than skin and bones, his breath coming in weak, ragged gasps. His fur, once thick and regal, was matted with filth, torn in places where deep wounds marred his body. His eyes, a dull amber, flickered open and closed, barely holding on. Hunger gnawed at him, a familiar ache, but tonight it was different. Tonight it wasn't just hunger. It was something deeper, a surrender. He had fought for so long, dodging kicks, flinching at raised hands, braving the cold with only his failing body as a shield. But tonight, there was no more fight left in him. The pain had won. The world blurred, fading into darkness. The sound of tires cutting through rainwater barely registered in his fading mind. Claire McAllister gripped the steering wheel, her fingers tightening involuntarily. The road ahead was barely visible through the relentless rain, her windshield wipers struggling to keep up. She had driven these back roads 100 times before, but tonight, something gnawed at her gut, an unease she couldn't place. She should have been home by now, curled up with a cup of tea, her old tabby cat purring at her feet. But work had run late, and the weather had worsened faster than she'd expected. She exhaled, focusing on the road, when something caught her eye. A shadow in the headlights, barely distinguishable against the soaked pavement. Her heart lurched. At first, she thought it was just debris, some abandoned trash, but as she drove closer, the shape became clearer. A dog. Claire's breath hitched. She slowed the car to a stop, her pulse thudding in her ears. The rain pounded against the roof, and she hesitated, fingers hovering over the door handle. She had seen stray dogs before, lost and wandering, but this was different. This one wasn't moving. She stepped out, boots sinking into the drenched earth, cold water immediately seeping into her jeans. The wind whipped against her, but she barely noticed. Every step she took toward the dog felt heavier, like the air itself was thick with something unspoken. And then she saw him up close. A German shepherd, if he could still be called that. His body was frail, ribs protruding, fur caked in mud and dried blood. He barely stirred as she knelt beside him, his chest rising and falling in shallow, desperate attempts to keep breathing. Something inside her cracked. She reached out slowly, fingers trembling, afraid that even the gentlest touch might break him further. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "You're not alone anymore." The dog didn't move. For a terrifying moment, Claire thought he was already gone. But then, a flicker. His eye, barely open, shifted ever so slightly in her direction. Not trust, not hope. Just acknowledgement. A silent understanding that he was seen. Claire swallowed against the lump in her throat. How long had he been here, waiting for someone to notice? How many people had driven past him, convincing themselves he was just another piece of roadkill? She glanced around, searching for any sign of a collar, an owner, something that might tell her where he had come from. But there was nothing. Just the desolate stretch of road, the storm, and a dog who had been abandoned long before tonight. Her fingers brushed his fur and he let out the faintest whimper. It was barely a sound, but it was enough. Enough to make her decision before she even realized she had made one. Claire stood, moving quickly back to her car. She threw open the back door, yanking the old blanket she kept there for emergencies. Her mind raced. She had no plan, no idea what she was going to do, only the certainty that she couldn't leave him here. Returning to his side, she knelt again, carefully wrapping the blanket around his frail body. He flinched, instinct taking over, but there was no strength left in him to fight. He let her lift him, so light, too light for a dog his size, and carry him to the car. As she placed him gently onto the back seat, he let out a sigh, his body sinking into the fabric as though it was the first softness he had felt in years. Claire shut the door, climbed into the driver's seat, and took one last glance at him in the rearview mirror. His eyes were closed again, his breathing still shallow but steady. She took a deep breath and started the car. She didn't know if he would make it, but she knew, without a doubt, that she would do everything in her power to give him the chance. The rain pounded against the windshield as Claire sped through the empty streets, her hands gripping the wheel tighter than she realized. Every now and then, she'd glance in the rearview mirror, checking on the German shepherd curled in the back seat. His breathing was shallow, his body motionless beneath the old blanket she had wrapped around him. She had no idea if he was going to make it. Her heart pounded in her chest, louder than the storm outside. Every mile felt like a battle against time. The city's emergency vet clinic was on the other side of town, and with the weather this bad, there was no telling how long it would take to get there. "Stay with me," she whispered, unsure if the dog could even hear her. The streets blurred past as she drove. She couldn't stop thinking about how fragile he had felt in her arms. Just skin, bones, and years of neglect. Someone had done this to him. Someone had let him starve, had left him to suffer. The thought burned in her chest, anger mixing with the helplessness she felt. She should have been used to this feeling. Working at the local animal shelter, Claire had seen her fair share of cruelty. Dogs dumped in alleyways, kittens left in boxes outside the shelter doors. She had learned to steel herself against the pain of it, to focus on what she could do instead of what had already been done. But this was different. There was something in the way he had looked at her, like he had already accepted his fate, like he had known deep down that no one was coming for him. Until now. Her tires screeched as she pulled into the parking lot of the emergency vet clinic. The neon sign flickered against the dark sky, casting a red glow over the wet pavement. Without hesitation, Claire threw the car into park and jumped out, yanking open the back door. "I need help!" she called, her voice barely audible over the rain. The clinic doors burst open, and a vet technician ran toward her, eyes widening at the sight of the shepherd in her back seat. "What happened?" the tech asked, already reaching for the dog. "I found him like this," Claire said, her voice tight. "He was barely breathing. I don't know how long he's been out there." The tech nodded, motioning for another staff member to bring a stretcher. Together, they carefully lifted the shepherd from the car, his body limp as they placed him onto the gurney. Claire could see it up close now, the deep scars beneath his matted fur, the raw wounds that spoke of months, maybe even years, of abuse. Her stomach twisted. The vet techs wheeled him inside, and Claire followed, barely aware of the rain soaking through her clothes. Inside, the clinic was bright, sterile. The air smelled of antiseptic and wet fur. Claire hovered near the entrance, watching as they rushed the shepherd into the back room, disappearing behind a set of swinging doors. And then, silence. She stood there, dripping onto the white tile floor, her hands trembling at her sides. There was nothing else she could do now. She had gotten him here. It was up to them to save him. Minutes passed, then an hour. Claire sat in the waiting area, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the door that led to the back rooms. She didn't even realize she was holding her breath until a voice broke the silence. "Are you the one who brought in the shepherd?" She looked up. A veterinarian stood in front of her, an older man with tired eyes and a clipboard in hand. "Yes," she said quickly, standing. "Is he?" "He's alive," the vet said, but his tone was cautious. "Barely. He's severely malnourished, dehydrated, and has multiple untreated wounds. Some of them are infected. If you hadn't found him when you did, he wouldn't have survived the night. Claire exhaled, her shoulders sagging. He's stable for now, the vet continued, but he's not out of the woods yet. His body is weak, and we're monitoring him closely. We'll need to keep him here for at least a few days. I'll pay, Claire said immediately. Whatever it costs, just do whatever you have to. The vet nodded, scribbling something onto his clipboard. Do you know who he belongs to? Claire asked, her voice tight. The vet sighed. There's no microchip, no collar, no records of a missing shepherd that matches his description. My guess, someone dumped him, left him to fend for himself. Claire clenched her fists at her sides. Of course. Of course, someone had abandoned him. She had seen it happen before. Dogs discarded like garbage, left behind when they were no longer convenient. She didn't know who had done this to him, but she knew one thing for certain. Whoever had left him out there didn't deserve to have him back. 3 days passed. Claire visited the clinic every day, checking in on the shepherd. The first day, he barely moved. He was too weak to even lift his head. But by the second day, there was a flicker of something. He opened his eyes when she spoke to him, his ears twitching at the sound of her voice. On the third day, when she walked into the room, he lifted his head just slightly, his dull amber eyes locking onto hers. Something inside her chest tightened. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, stepping closer. He didn't flinch. He didn't cower like he expected her to hurt him. That was progress. The vet had told her not to get her hopes up. Even if he survived, there was no telling what kind of long-term damage he had suffered. His body was weak, and the trauma he had endured wouldn't just disappear overnight. But Claire didn't care how long it took. She sat beside his crate, watching as he blinked at her slowly. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" she whispered. "I don't know who did this to you, but I swear, you'll never have to go through it again." The shepherd let out a slow breath, as if her words reached him in a way he couldn't fully understand, but wanted to believe. A thought began to form in Claire's mind, one she had been pushing away since the moment she had found him. What if she didn't just save him? What if she kept him? She exhaled, rubbing a hand over her face. She wasn't even sure if he would recover fully. And even if he did, she wasn't exactly in a position to take in a dog, let alone one with so much trauma. But then she looked at him again, at the way he was watching her now, not with fear, not with hesitation. Just quiet acceptance. As if, for the first time, he was starting to believe he was safe. And just like that, the decision was made. When he was ready, when the vet gave the all clear, she would bring him home. Not just as a rescue, as family. It was 2 weeks later when Claire received the call. Her heart sank the moment she saw the clinic's number flash on her phone. She had been so focused on his recovery, on getting him through each day, that she hadn't prepared for the possibility of setbacks. The shepherd had been making progress, slow but steady. But now, as she listened to the vet's voice on the other end of the line, a chill crept into her chest. "Claire," the vet said, his voice cautious. "We need to talk." "Is he okay?" Her voice wavered with a mix of fear and hope, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Physically, he's stable," the vet replied. "But I'm afraid there's something you need to be aware of. We've been running some behavioral tests, and there's a significant issue. He's showing signs of severe trauma, psychological damage. He reacts with panic at even the smallest movements, and there are signs of aggression when he feels cornered." Claire's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, aggression?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's terrified, Claire. His fear triggers these outbursts. It's not something we haven't seen before in abused animals, but with his size and strength, it's a problem. If you decide to take him home, you need to be prepared. This could take months, maybe longer, to unlearn the damage." Claire closed her eyes, feeling the weight of his words. She had known it wouldn't be easy. She had known that a dog who had been through such hell would have scars that went beyond the surface. But this This was harder than she had imagined. "Is there a chance he can get better?" she whispered, her throat tight. "There's always a chance. But it will take time, and it will require a lot of patience. We're doing our best, but you need to understand the kind of work this will take." "I understand," she said, her voice barely audible. After the call ended, Claire sat in her car for a long time, the rain tapping against the windshield in a slow, rhythmic pattern. She didn't know what to do. Could she take him home knowing how much work it would be? Could she handle the fear, the aggression, the possibility that he might never be the dog she had hoped he would be? And yet, she couldn't stop thinking about him, the way he had looked at her with those tired, yet trusting eyes. She had made a promise to him, a promise that she wouldn't leave him behind no matter what. But could she live up to that promise? Could she handle it? The decision weighed heavily on her heart, but it wasn't one she could put off. The next morning, Claire went to the clinic. The shepherd was in a back room, lying on a soft bed. His coat had started to shine a little more, his ribs less pronounced, though still visible. He was a shadow of what he could have been, but he was alive, and that was enough. She knelt beside him, gently stroking his fur, her hand trembling slightly as he lifted his head to meet her gaze. His eyes weren't empty anymore. They held something, an awareness, maybe hope. She didn't know. The vet came in a few minutes later, offering her a cautious smile. "We've been working with him on some calming exercises. He's improving, but we're still not there yet. Are you sure you want to take him home today?" Claire nodded. "I'm sure," she said, though her voice was thick with uncertainty. The vet's expression softened. "All right. Just be careful with him, Claire. He's still fragile. Don't try to push him too hard. And if the aggression gets worse, it's okay to ask for help. He's been through more than we can imagine." She nodded, but her mind was already racing. She couldn't back out now. Not when he was this close to being hers. "Thank you," she said quietly. As she led him to the car, he followed her willingly, though he was still hesitant, his steps slow and unsure. He had come to trust her, but there was a part of him still buried deep inside, a part that expected betrayal, pain, or abandonment at any moment. When they reached her apartment, Claire opened the door and gestured for him to enter. He hesitated at the threshold, his body stiff and tense, but with a gentle prod, he stepped inside. The apartment was quiet, warm, and safe. It wasn't much, but it was home. She watched as he took in his surroundings, sniffing at the corners, cautiously walking into the living room, his tail slightly lowered. He wasn't comfortable yet, but he wasn't backing away either. This was a small victory. Claire sank down onto the couch, watching him as he circled the room before finally lying down on the rug. His body was still tense, but there was a subtle shift. He seemed to realize, in that moment, that he was safe. For the first time in a long while, the shepherd closed his eyes without fear, his breathing deep and even. Claire sat back, her eyes lingering on him. She had no idea what the future would bring, but for now, this was enough. The road ahead was uncertain, but as long as they had each other, she could face it. Days passed into weeks. At first, everything was difficult. The shepherd, who Claire had begun calling Max, reacted to every sudden movement. His eyes would widen in panic, his body would stiffen, and he'd retreat to the farthest corner of the room, growling softly as if expecting to be hurt. It wasn't easy. It wasn't anything like the peaceful companionship she had imagined when she first found him. But every day, Claire took it slow. She let him come to her. She didn't force any affection. She just let him exist beside her, knowing that was what he needed. Some days were better than others. There were times when Max would cautiously approach her, allowing her to pet him gently, his tail slowly wagging as if testing the waters. Other days he would hide for hours, retreating into himself and refusing to come out. But through it all, Claire didn't give up. She had promised him, after all. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the skyline, Claire sat on the couch, reading a book. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on the rug, eyes half closed. The TV hummed quietly in the background. And then, it happened. Max stirred, standing slowly. He walked over to her, his movements tentative. He stopped just in front of her, looking up at her with those amber eyes. For the first time in weeks, Claire saw something in his gaze, a small glimmer of trust, of understanding. He nudged her hand with his nose, a gentle request for attention. Claire froze. Her breath caught in her throat as she slowly reached down, hesitating only for a moment. She stroked his fur, and for the first time, Max didn't flinch. He leaned into her touch, letting out a soft sigh. Tears pricked at Claire's eyes as she gently scratched behind his ears. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Max wasn't just surviving anymore. He was healing. The night was still. Too still. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, pressing in on Claire like a weight she couldn't shake. She sat on the floor beside Max's bed, her fingers tracing the fabric of his blanket absent-mindedly. He was sleeping, his breath slow and steady, but Claire wasn't fooled. The day had been rough, his worst episode yet. It had happened so fast. 1 second, he was cautiously sniffing at a new toy she had bought for him, and the next, something in his mind had snapped. Maybe it was the sudden movement of her hand, or the way the shadows flickered across the room. But whatever it was, it sent him spiraling. He had lunged, not at her, but at the air, his body stiff with panic. His growls had been low, deep, almost guttural, and his eyes, they hadn't been his eyes anymore. They were wild, filled with something ancient and raw, something that had been forced into him through years of pain. Claire had barely managed to calm him down, speaking softly, keeping her hands where he could see them. It had taken nearly half an hour for him to finally stop trembling, to stop panting like he was still running from something invisible. And now, here they were. The aftermath. Claire let out a slow, shaky breath. She had known it would be hard. She had known that Max was broken in ways that wouldn't be fixed overnight. But in this moment, sitting here on the cold floor, doubt crept in like a shadow. What if she wasn't enough? What if she couldn't do this? She ran a hand through her hair, staring at Max as he slept. He looked so peaceful now, curled up on his side, his ears twitching every so often as if caught in some distant dream. She wondered if he dreamed of the past, of the people who had hurt him, of the nights he had spent starving, abandoned, waiting for someone who would never come. Tears burned at the back of her eyes. "I don't know if I can do this, Max," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm strong enough." The words felt like a betrayal, even as she said them. She had promised him. Promised that she wouldn't give up, that she wouldn't turn away like everyone else had. But what if love wasn't enough? What if no matter how much she tried, no matter how much patience she had, Max would never truly trust her? She hugged her knees to her chest, swallowing against the lump in her throat. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. The apartment was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the walls. Everything felt heavy, as if the world itself was pressing down on her. And then, a sound. Software barely there. Claire blinked, looking up just in time to see Max stirring. His ears twitched, and then, slowly, his eyes opened. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. Then, something happened that Claire hadn't expected. Max moved. Not away from her, not in fear, but toward her. Slowly, cautiously, he stretched his legs and lifted his head, inching forward until his nose barely touched her knee. His breath was warm against her skin. He hesitated, his body still tense, but he didn't pull away. Claire's heart stilled. It wasn't much. It wasn't some grand, dramatic moment where everything suddenly clicked into place. But it was something. A step, a choice. And maybe, just maybe, it was enough. She reached out, carefully resting her hand against his head. He flinched, just a little, but he didn't move away. Instead, he let out a slow sigh, his body relaxing ever so slightly beneath her touch. Claire closed her eyes, her fingers gently running through his fur. She wasn't giving up. Not tonight. Not ever. Because if Max still had fight left in him, if he still had even the smallest bit of trust left to give, then she would fight too. For him. For both of them. The morning after Max's worst episode, Claire woke up on the floor next to his bed. Her back ached from the hard surface, and the cold had settled deep into her bones. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that Max was still there. He lay curled in the same spot where he had nudged her knee the night before. His breathing was deep, slow, steady. For the first time since bringing him home, Claire noticed something different about him, something almost imperceptible. He wasn't just existing. He was resting. She exhaled softly, stretching her sore limbs as she stood. The day ahead felt uncertain, but she had already made her choice. No matter how long it took, no matter how many setbacks they had, she was going to help him heal. She moved quietly around the apartment, not wanting to startle him. When she placed his food bowl on the floor, she hesitated, watching to see how he would react. At first, Max didn't move. He lifted his head slightly, ears flicking toward her, his eyes wary but not fearful. Then, slowly, cautiously, he stretched his legs and stood. His body was still too thin, his movement stiff, but he was moving. He padded toward the bowl, sniffing at it before taking a tentative bite. Claire felt something deep in her chest crack open. This was progress. Small, but real. She moved to the kitchen, letting him eat in peace. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, her mind replayed everything the vet had told her. The trauma he carried wouldn't disappear overnight. There would be good days and bad ones. She had to be ready for both. But as she sipped her coffee, something caught her attention. A sound, faint but unmistakable. She turned slowly, heart pounding as she saw Max standing a few feet away, watching her. He had finished eating, and instead of retreating to his usual corner, he had followed her. Claire set her cup down, barely daring to breathe. "Hey, buddy," she murmured, keeping her voice soft. "You okay?" Max's ears twitched at the sound of her voice. Then, in a moment so small yet so monumental, he took a step toward her. Claire's throat tightened. He was choosing this, choosing her. Carefully, she knelt, extending her hand. Max hesitated, his body tense, but then, he closed the distance, his cold, wet nose pressed gently against her palm. A touch, a connection. Claire didn't move, didn't speak, just let him have this moment on his own terms. And then, for the first time since she had found him, Max's tail gave the tiniest wag. Tears welled in Claire's eyes as she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. This was it. This was trust. The next few days were the best they had ever had. Max was still cautious, still hesitant, but something had changed. He started following Claire around the apartment, staying close without being afraid. When she sat on the couch at night, he would lie a few feet away, not close enough for contact, but near enough that she knew he was there. It was slow. It was fragile, but it was real. Then everything went wrong. It happened so fast. One moment they were having a quiet evening, and the next there was a knock at the door. Claire barely had time to react before Max bolted. His entire body tensed, his ears pinned back. His breathing turned sharp and erratic. Claire's heart pounded as she moved toward him. "Max, it's okay," she whispered. "It's just someone at the door." But Max wasn't listening. His mind had gone somewhere else, somewhere dark. The past had reached out and pulled him back under. Then, before Claire could stop him, he bolted. His claws scraped against the floor as he lunged for the back door, the one she had accidentally left slightly ajar earlier in the day. The moment it happened, Claire's stomach dropped. "No, Max!" But it was too late. He was gone. Claire ran outside, her feet slipping against the damp pavement as she called his name. "Max!" The wind howled around her, whipping her hair into her face. The night was cold, the streets empty. Panic clawed at her chest. She had been so careful, so patient, but one mistake, one knock on the door, had unraveled everything. She sprinted toward the road, scanning the darkness. Her mind raced with all the horrible possibilities. He was still weak, still recovering. What if he ran into traffic? What if someone— No. She couldn't think like that. Claire sucked in a breath, forcing herself to focus. Think. Where would he go? She closed her eyes, heart hammering. Max's instincts would drive him to a place that felt safe, somewhere quiet, somewhere away from people. And then it hit her, the abandoned lot. It was the same place she had found him, miles away, but if Max was truly lost in his fear, he might try to go back there. Claire didn't hesitate. She grabbed her keys, jumped into her car, and sped through the empty streets. The lot was exactly as she remembered it. Dark, desolate, forgotten. Her headlights cast eerie shadows across the cracked pavement. She slammed the door shut and ran, her breath visible in the cold night air. "Max!" she called. "Please, come back!" For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing. And then, a sound. A whimper. Claire's breath caught. She turned toward the far end of the lot, her eyes scanning the darkness. And then she saw him. Max was curled against the base of an old rusted dumpster. His body was trembling, his head lowered. He had gone back to the last place he had known. The last place he had waited to die. Tears blurred Claire's vision as she approached. "Max," she whispered, kneeling a few feet away. "It's okay. I'm here." His ears flicked toward her voice, but he didn't move. Claire's chest ached. She knew what this was. Max thought he had failed. He had been given a home, a chance, and now, in his broken mind, he had ruined it. But he hadn't. He never had. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Max," she said again, softer this time. "Look at me." Slowly, hesitantly, he lifted his head. His amber eyes met hers, and in them she saw everything. The pain, the fear, but also something else. A plea. Claire didn't reach for him. She didn't try to pull him close. Instead, she did the one thing he needed most. She stayed. She sat down in the cold, on the dirty pavement, just a few feet away. She didn't force him to move, didn't tell him everything was okay. She just waited. And then, after what felt like forever, Max moved. It was slow, almost uncertain, but he took one step, then another. And then finally, he closed the space between them, pressing his head gently against her shoulder. Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She wrapped her arms around him, her hands sinking into his fur. "You don't have to run anymore," she whispered. "You're safe." For the first time in his life, Max believed it. And this time, he didn't run. The ride home was quiet. Max lay curled in the back seat, his breathing slow but steady. He was exhausted, his body heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. Claire kept glancing at him in the rearview mirror, her heart aching. He had run, not because he didn't trust her, but because trust was a fragile thing. One loud knock, one small reminder of the past, and everything had shattered. But he had come back. Or maybe she had found him before he could disappear completely. As they pulled into the driveway, Claire exhaled slowly. She turned off the car, but she didn't move right away. "Come on, buddy," she said softly. "Let's go home." The word felt different this time. Home. Not just a place. Not just shelter. Something more. She opened the door and stepped out, waiting. Max lifted his head slightly, ears flicking as he took in his surroundings. Then, after a long moment, he shifted, slowly climbing out of the car. His steps were hesitant as they walked to the apartment door. Claire didn't rush him. She let him move at his own pace, feeling the night's cold air settle around them. When they stepped inside, Max paused. It was as if he was realizing something, that the door hadn't closed behind him to keep him in, that he wasn't trapped, that he wasn't going to be abandoned again. Claire knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his back. "You're safe," she murmured. He didn't flinch. Instead, for the first time, he leaned into her touch. The next few weeks were different. Max still had his moments, flinching at loud noises, tensing when someone knocked at the door. Some nights, he would wake up trembling, lost in nightmares Claire couldn't erase, but he was healing, slowly, steadily. One morning, as Claire stood at the counter making coffee, she felt something brush against her leg. She froze, looking down. Maximum. He had come to her, not because he needed something, not because he was afraid, just because he wanted to be close. Tears stung her eyes as she reached down, running her fingers through his fur. "Hey, buddy," she whispered. Max looked up at her, his amber eyes warm, steady. The fear was still there, deep beneath the surface. It might never fully go away. But for the first time, there was something else too. Something stronger. Trust. Months passed. Spring melted into summer, and the days stretched longer. Claire and Max found a rhythm together. Morning walks through the quiet park. Afternoons spent in the sun, Max dozing lazily on the porch. Evenings curled up in the living room, a movie playing in the background. He wasn't the same broken dog she had found that night in the rain. His fur had grown thick again, healthy and soft. His ribs no longer showed. His eyes, once dull and empty, now held something steady. A light. One evening, as Claire sat on the couch reading, Max wandered over. He hesitated for only a moment before climbing up beside her, curling his body against her legs. Claire smiled, resting a hand on his back. "You finally figured it out, huh?" she murmured. Max let out a soft sigh, his body relaxing into hers. She didn't need an answer. She already knew. He was home. And this time, he wasn't going anywhere. Max's story is more than just a rescue. It's a testament to resilience, trust, and the power of second chances. There are countless animals out there, waiting for someone to see them, to save them, to give them a home. If Max's journey moved you, consider visiting your local shelter, fostering, or simply spreading awareness. Every act of kindness can change a life. What would you have done if you found Max that night? Let us know in the comments. And if this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because every story deserves to be told.